This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Nice to see you guys.
Hello.
All righty, on the show, artificial sweeteners and food additives and their impact on your metabolism. I want to start with the elephant in the room, Dr. Cooper. We have a diabetes epidemic and pre-diabetes epidemic. We have an obesity epidemic in our country, and yet we sell billions of dollars of diet soda. So my question, very plainly, if diet soda worked, how come we're not all skinny?
Well, that's the greatest question, and you're not the only one asking that. So all the new research really is showing the absolute counterintuitive results that you would imagine, where these artificial sweeteners appear to be increasing the risk of obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
So how does that happen? What's happening when there are all kinds of artificial sweeteners that we can put in our foods, but diet sodas are so pervasive. It's like just tons and tons. When we have an artificial sweetener, when we eat it, what happens, Dr. Cooper, in our bodies?
Well, I don't think anyone really totally understands it, but most likely what's really going on is it goes back to the fact that we can't trick our brain. And this is an attempt to trick your brain into sensing something sweet, but then it registers that it's what's called non-nutritive. There's no nutrition in it. There's no calories. There's no sugar in it. So it starts to put your brain in a mode of fear that you're actually trying to trick it, basically. So
it's like that Disney movie in the control center up in our brain, and it's like, this is so good. This is hey, huh? Oh, what?
Yeah.
What?
There are no calories, and we just tasted sweet.
Exactly.
And then it's like, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, and
the alarm goes
well,
off.
it's true. And I think, and then they started to notice that the insulin regulation gets thrown off because insulin's a normal response to caloric intake. And so that can lead to disrupted insulin regulation, disrupted glucose regulation, and all the hormones that say we're hungry versus we're nourished. So it could actually throw off quite a bit of things. And that's what they're starting to uncover when they're looking at the whys of this. But it's not actually that new. I mean, they've started noticing that a long, long time ago, but it didn't really gain steam until more recently. And so now I think it's a little bit more widely accepted that these non-nutritive sweeteners can promote diabetes, obesity, and just the very things that people are using them to prevent.
That's crazy.
So it's like all the things you want in a diet soda and none of the plus.
Yeah. Well, our patients ask us, what should we do? I just say use actual sweetener, real sweetener, like sugar,
Right,
maple
use
syrup,
sugar.
honey, brown sugar, anything that's an actual sweetener.
I think when I realized that a teaspoon of sugar is 16 calories, because I was still in the calorie mode when I understood this, I was like, 16 calories is really so nothing. If you were looking at a cup of coffee kind of thing.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I guess you're really not saving very much when you're using that. Since I didn't use tons and tons of sugar, I was like, well, that really is not that much of a savings. And I was thinking more of the cancer issues. I was like, Go with the
Yeah.
sugar. It tastes better.
Well, and you can imagine if you're tricking your body all the time with that non-nutritive sweetener, eventually your body will fight back and you'll probably end up eating like way more sugar than a normal intake eventually because you've been driven to do that biologically. So having a little sugar here and there is considered totally normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question I have, Dr. Cooper, is if somebody's out to dinner and they feel like having a beverage, are you saying it's okay to have like a regular pop?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's some issues with pop to begin with now.
Because it's just like straight sugar into the
Well,
Right.
bloodstream,
it's not
right?
just that, but there's other
There's a lot of
chemical
it.
additives too that they're now really looking at in sodas. The brominated vegetable oil and I mean, most of the larger companies have started to voluntarily take out some of these things that they've realized can be really bad for our health in terms of again, metabolic syndrome, and hormonal dysregulation, like even with thyroid levels and all of that. So soda itself, you have to watch out for other things in there besides just the sugar. But I mean, if you have a soda once in a while, that's fine. Of course, you don't want to just like have a soda instead of a meal. And I think people, when they eat on a regular basis, very consistently, and have a pretty stable metabolism, they're not going to gravitate to drinking like a lot of soda on a daily basis and, in excess amounts.
I think one of the things that I noticed most dramatically, Dr. Cooper, when I first came to see you, is that prior to being treated, I would have these massive sugar cravings where like I could go to a movie theater and literally eat an entire box of red vines and have a slushy. And I don't even know how much sugar is in
Yeah.
that. Or
Quite a bit.
and especially after meals, I would like, oh man, I feel like something sweet.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you now that I'm on this regimen, I never have cravings like that anymore. Like never.
Yeah.
I never think so. But so, if I do have a little something sweet, it tastes really good and it's really satisfying. But I never have that just gnawing craving for sugar that I used to have before. What's the reason for
Well,
that?
the reason is that what was actually happening when you first came was whenever you would eat anything, it didn't matter if it was a high sugar food or just a bagel or even just like a bowl of oatmeal with something else, like a totally balanced meal. I remember you used to have your avocado toast with your salmon and everything. But whenever you would eat anything, your insulin prematurely spiked up, which is a form of metabolic dysfunction that we see in some patients. And so the minute the food hits your mouth, your insulin would go out of control, like way too high, way too fast. And that caused your blood sugar to drop, like to literally crash after you ate. And so when that happens and you have hypoglycemia, which is that low blood sugar, you will crave
Mhm.
sugar. You're supposed to crave
Yeah.
sugar because you need to rescue that low blood sugar and get it back up. So that's a natural symptom of hypoglycemia is craving sugar. So I think part of your sugar cravings were just that you had that and it was not under control. Now
Yeah.
that it's under control, you're just not getting those crashes. So you're not seeing the need to just go consume a bunch of sugar.
And again, refreshing people on the role of insulin. It
Hmm.
really is that hormone that takes sugar from the bloodstream and distributes it into the
Yeah.
muscles and
Right.
cells and stuff.
Exactly. That's what it does. It's kind of like it delivers it to the tissue so they can use it for fuel. And if it comes from the pancreas, it's a hormone produced by the pancreas and it's produced normally in response to eating, but it's supposed to be matching very efficiently the whatever the glucose levels are doing. So as you eat, it's supposed to slowly rise and just help deliver some of the fuel to the muscles and to the rest of the body to use as energy. But when you have an overactive response, it comes on prematurely before you actually digested any of the food that you just ate, either, and so then it's clearing out
Hmm.
your blood of glucose that was keeping everything stable. So that leaves your brain feeling like it's basically starving and trying to send you messages to consume more sugar, basically.
If you eat an unrefined sugar, Like a natural sugar, is that better than a refined sugar, like a white sugar?
They've not shown any real differences between different types of sugar when you look at like gram per gram of carbohydrate content in the sugar, whether, regardless of what it is. I mean, there may be some very slight differences in how it's metabolized, but nothing that's significantly going to change, anything from one to the other. So I would just consume the one that tastes the best to you.
Hmm. That's interesting.
What about stevia, Dr. Cooper? It's a sugar substitute that I think is sort of billed as more natural. Do we know anything about stevia and its impacts on our metabolism?
Well, I think stevia, I don't think it's dangerous like some of the chemical non nutritive sweeteners. But from a scientific standpoint, it has been shown to lower leptin levels. Again, the same kind of thing, tricking the body into sensing something sweet that is not nutritive. So it's not detecting the caloric makeup. It's not actually a sugar, but it sort of masquerades as one. And so that too, we try to watch out for that with people if they have low leptin levels because it can suppress it further.
Okay, let's open another can of worms here, and that is food additives. In the notes that you sent us a little bit ago, you say there are something like 3,000 different food additives.
Yeah,
And
almost.
you've told us, I think, in the past, when we read food labels, if there's more than a few ingredients in something, we ought to think twice about eating it, right?
I really think so because it's apparently there's like 2,800 or something of these like registered food additives. And it turns out there's the FDA that assumes everything's safe till it's proven to be harmful, basically. Once it's proven to be harmful, they may pull it, but that process could take decades. And so in the meantime, we've got all these additives that we don't know a whole lot about. Some of them, there is more known about them, and some states are trying to start labeling some foods with warnings that contain certain of these additives. But I think it's misleading to kind of isolate like 1, 2, or 3 or handful of these substances and tell people, watch out for these. It's very misleading because then while you're watching out for those, there's a whole other slew of them that might be even more dangerous that are there. And so it gives a false sense of security. And we saw that happen also with food packaging when people started becoming aware that BPA wasn't so good for us. So they start trying to avoid that. And in the meantime,
And explain BPA again.
BPA is a lining it's like a type of plastic lining that is lining beverage containers or canned foods primarily. And also on the tops of like jar, glass bottles, the caps. So it prevents things from absorbing into there or it prevents the cans from corroding and things. And so that has been shown to be really linked to disturbing the metabolic system and increasing obesity and metabolic syndrome, especially in children. And so that, got some bad press. Now it's not banned, but a lot of marketers say this is BPA free. So people gravitate now. But what they don't know is they've substituted it with BPS, which is actually just as bad. So it's, again, a false sense of security. So that's why I don't like to get into like which ones people should avoid, because then little do you know, you're, leaving one and going straight to another one that might be more dangerous. So that's the issue.
And with 3,000, we could spend the rest of our lives.
We could.
Trying to figure it
We
out.
could.
I think the answer is try and buy something as close. I think one time you told me, Dr. Cooper, that try and buy something as close to how it was grown or how it was made or how it was cooked, as close to that as possible.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm really kind of excited right now because there is more awareness developing. And it's kind of funny because years ago, it had to be more than a decade ago, there were some researchers that were all out to show that these low carb diets were better than the low fat diets, And so they were pitting one diet against another. They were trying to show that carbs were bad. But then what they found out was it wasn't what they thought. that no matter what type of diet someone followed, the results were the same, basically. And so these same researchers that I was upset with at first, they evolved and have done amazing research now where they've pretty much figured out that most of what is making us unhealthy in the food supply is not the food. It's not the food at all. So they have done studies that equalize for the things that have been the villains, in our thinking, which are sugar, fat, salt, and then, low fiber carbs. So they've made research studies that take that out of the equation. They equalize those, but they just change the food to be either more in its natural state, as Andrea was describing, versus heavily processed with chemical processing, food additives, and then packaging that, contains these chemicals. And that's where the difference is. So this is where the term ultra processed foods came from that is being used now. And so I think it's fantastic what they did, because now they have taken away, the good food, bad food concept. And it's much more about what we do with our food, how we produce the food, and how we package the food. And so when we're talking about ultra processed, we're not talking about, turning a grain into flour or into bread or pasta. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about chemicals that are used in the processing, chemicals that are added to the food that are not food, basically, and packaging that is now emitting chemicals into the food that is contained within that packaging. And so just isolating that aspect, they're seeing all kinds of terrible things, like increase in all-cause mortality, including a lot of metabolic risk, a lot.
Right. Like, how can something be in a can or be in a box or be in a package for 2 years? I don't understand it.
Yeah.
I'm like, something's got to be in there that's maybe not right. I mean, I guess it could be, but they're obviously putting something in there.
Yeah, and they are saying that's true, Andrea. They're saying that the longer it's in the package, it depends on, what the package is.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, but also the temperature it's stored in, or the temperature it was when it went into the package, that all could impact it. And as you know, a lot of our fast food is wrapped in those paper wrappers that are impermeable to grease and things like that. Same thing with fast food containers and pizza boxes. And so that's really right now under a lot of scrutiny. And I know in California, they've tried to ban some things. In Washington State, we have tried to ban some of it's called PFAS, which I guess is a lot of different chemicals, but it's used for that purpose, for greasy food storage or transport or wet foods and things like that. But that is shown to be really not good for us. And unfortunately, it's now in the water supply pretty much everywhere in the country above the EPA limits. The EPA recently reduced the safe limits, and it's at like 300% in a lot of different areas around the country. So it's hard to get away from these things because we've become so accustomed to using them. And apparently, it's really hard to get them banned by the FDA. Apparently, it's like really hard to do. So it's going to be up to consumers to become more aware. And hopefully there would be a way that states could implement some kind of warning system on foods. But I think it's like you said, Andrea, in the meantime, why do we want to even take a chance? Why not just, try our best to consume foods that don't have that laundry list of ingredients, even things that sound innocent, like potassium bromide, for example. Turns out that's not safe. And it's like used, I think, as a dough conditioner in breads. It's just not safe. And it sounds so innocent. Potassium,
it's like, that sounds okay. Yeah, I've heard of it. I could pronounce it.
Exactly. So now one of the things that might be tough, though, is this isn't very equitable because there's people that can't really afford to buy foods that are not
Right.
processed that way because those ultra processed foods tend to cost less. And so that's going to be tough. But there are ways if you can, or it could be even that you don't have time to prepare your foods.
It's the time. I was going to add that
Mhm.
because some of it is time. I mean, it's easier to pick up something in a bag or in a box than to make it. And I know they have a campaign here on television. I'm one of the few people that does watch actual real television. And there's a campaign about making snacks and making foods from fresh foods and how it's cheaper.
That's great.
There was one about making energy drinks that I remember, like, we did a thing on when we were doing our segments on television about making
Yeah.
energy drinks to bring to kids' soccer games, and it was the same kind of thing because it is cheaper
Mhm.
to do that,
Yeah,
but it takes
it
time,
does.
and a lot of parents don't have that time.
It is hard, and you have to think ahead of time and,
Right.
get more creative with your menu planning and things like that. But I think it is a really good idea to look at our food differently and think of what's in this that is real food versus
Right.
not just these
And
chemicals.
I mean, I certainly don't have time to make bread.
No.
But, you know, I know that like, there's a lot of preservatives
Mhm.
in
But you
breads.
can get bread that doesn't have the preservatives, but again, is it more expensive, to get bread
Yes.
from a local bakery?
It goes bad
Mhm,
fast.
but you can freeze it too. So,
Right.
there's little tricks.
I think it's a lot of
Yeah,
education for me.
yeah, I think so too. I think it's pretty sad about the food packaging situation that we're in and how there's so much getting into our water supply because then what do you do about that if you're being careful about your food, but then your water's contaminated too. So,
What do?
yeah.
You can't turn the faucet on somewhere
No.
else.
But I think we have to just stay positive and not try to be again, it goes back to,
No.
like, don't try to be perfect with this. Do your best
Exactly.
to just think it through. Is there a way to eliminate some of these things and not just trust the food industry to do what's responsible? Because that seems to
Uh,
take a long time to happen.
but I think what you said earlier was really good. Like, the fewer things that are on the label, the better.
Yeah, that's a simple way to look at it, and if you really recognize them all as foods, I mean, that's
Yeah,
fantastic.
I think that's a good
Mhm.
thing.
Well, and other countries have different
Oh,
guidelines.
there's so many different things that are in other countries that are banned that we have here, like, especially in, like,
Yes,
cookies and packaged cakes and cookies that we have here that in Europe they won't
yes,
allow. I don't know what they all are, but there's a lot of
it's
them.
true, yeah, there's different guidelines throughout the world, and it's kinda nice to see that I didn't realize that states can actually themselves try to establish their own guidelines, and California
Yeah.
has been at the forefront of a lot of this.
Yeah, we have a lot of stuff that other people can't.
Yeah, your state has banned and has, like, stickers on different products to show that they contain lead or they contain other things.
Right.
So, I think that's wonderful. I think if more states kind of follow that, it would be helpful.
So I guess what I'm hearing, Dr. Cooper, is that like if we have food that doesn't have preservatives, it's pretty easy to see in the fridge. It goes bad in a few days and it has mold all over it and everything. But the stuff like Andrea said that can sit on a shelf for like seriously years, that's got to have a ton of stuff in there that is just not natural to food.
Yes, it's just not, and it's most likely not good for our body. It can't be that every single thing in there is safe for us. We don't necessarily have enough research to prove whether it really
Mm.
truly is safe or harmful. So, until that happens, we're going to be exposed. And to think that we have almost 3,000 additives, how long would it take to actually look at each of those to verify whether or not they're safe?
And what's interesting is that you'd think that the onus would be on the companies using those chemicals to study them, because doing a double blind, placebo controlled study on these chemicals would be very expensive, very time consuming. And so there's no incentive.
Yeah.
I wish
It,
maybe our government would jump in and say,
I
hey, before you can use this, you need to prove that it's safe.
Well, one issue I think is the FDA does have a process for registering these things. I was trying to like look on their website, and they do require a certain amount of information about what should be added, and then they determine whether it's called generally safe, I guess. And some of the things on that list are just simple things like spices and, you know, things that are just in nature. But I'm not sure exactly what they do require beyond just a very rudimentary look at things to determine the safety. They definitely don't require double blind, placebo controlled studies in humans. They
Yeah.
definitely don't require that.
What about, I read something about kids' water bottles and those not being good, like the plasticky ones, that they should
Yeah.
maybe go for the ones that are metal or maybe glass or something because there's some kind of
Yeah.
bad stuff,
Well,
bad stuff.
yeah, it's, the little crinkly plastic water bottles have been known to have
Oh, yeah.
phthalates and just other plasticizer chemicals that get in the water and that are really not good for us, not good for our metabolism or our health. But what's interesting is recently they also noted that bottled water, they were looking at bottled water in plastic bottles, contained a huge amount of plastic particles in the water. And
Like chunks?
yeah, well, you can't see them. I mean, they're so
Oh.
tiny you wouldn't see, and you may not taste them or see them or anything. You probably wouldn't detect them, but there's a lot of them in there. And that is not good that we're ingesting that when we consume water that way. And some of that was thought to come from not just the bottle that it's stored in, but the processing, also some parts in the processing equipment. Um, so there's all kinds of things when you think about food and food additives and beverage additives, because it starts with the natural thing that you're going to try to deliver in a mass quantity. And then where is that coming from and what exposures are there? Do we have exposure to lead? Do we have exposure to cadmium? Other dangerous metals, and before it even gets into the processing plants. So it could be microbes, organisms, it could be all kinds of stuff before it even gets there. Then once it gets there, the machinery that they use to process it into whatever they're doing, does that have parts that are made of lead that's imparting into the food supply or the beverage supply, or does that have other chemicals that it's imparting that aren't really listed as an ingredient? And then it's stored in that package, and some of that plastic could permeate into it, but that's not listed on the food label either, you know? So all is what they actually put in it, the ingredients, but you don't know a lot about, the rest of what could also be in that. So,
And then I've always heard also, you know how sometimes you have a water bottle and that you got and for, not one that you have, but one that was you've purchased and maybe you didn't finish it. You leave it in the car and the car gets hot and then you might come back to it. That's a terrible idea. That you shouldn't drink water that was heated up
no.
in the car. That the water that the plastic leaches onto the water that you
Right.
would drink. Don't do that. Don't do that.
But
That you have to throw that water
but then
away.
again, how do you know it wasn't exposed to that kind of heat before you even
When it was
got it?
shipping,
Yeah.
in the shipping
Uh-huh.
process, in the truck, because inside a truck, that was what I was thinking about one time when they said that. I was like, well, when the truck was bringing it from wherever, it was probably hot as hell in the truck.
Right. It's hard. It's easy to sit here and say how you can just avoid these things, but for a lot of people, it's very tough because of their lifestyle and their circumstances, and of course, we always say it's better to eat something, than to wait for the perfect thing. So you kind of
Right.
just need to work with this awareness and figure out how to navigate to try to keep your environment as healthy as you can, including, your food and beverage supply.
And we have to kind of pick our battles
Right.
too, right? I mean, one thing I
Right.
stopped doing a long time ago was microwaving plastics. So
Yes.
I put my
Good
Yes.
point.
leftovers in glass, and when I heat it up, it's in
Yes.
glass. And it just makes me cringe to think I don't know what the health impacts could be, Dr. Cooper. Have there been any
Not good.
studies about microwaving plastics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's not good. Even in the frozen foods that come in those plastic containers, it's
Yeah,
better
right.
to
Oh,
yeah, it's better to
yeah.
flip it onto a plate, a microwave safe plate to reheat it. It's just anything that you're heating when it's with plastic is not good. And remember, people used to take the styrofoam cups and put those
Oh,
in the
man.
microwave.
Oh, sure. Do they even sell styrofoam really anymore?
I
I
haven't
thought that
seen
was
it for a
banned.
while. Yeah, I don't think so.
But you're right. Everyone did use that
Hmm.
before we now all switched to our glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a rising awareness. As we wrap things up, I guess in summary, Dr. Cooper, we can probably pretty safely say that it's not generally a good idea to use artificial sweeteners, right? Because you just
Right.
can't trick your brain.
Right. And
Go back to
yeah.
sugar.
Well, that's proven now that it doesn't offer any kind of improvement over just using sugar. That's proven. And in fact, it does show in many studies a triggering of metabolic dysfunction. So there's really no reason to be using artificial sweeteners.
So that's artificial sweeteners. And then give us a good summary statement, Dr. Cooper, if you would, on just additives in general.
Well, I think it's impossible, as we said, to avoid them. They're in our environment, whether it's in our food supply, our household cleaning supplies, the air we're breathing. It's basically everywhere, even in the clothing that we wear. So you can't eliminate it from your life. But I think being a little bit more aware and putting a little more effort into your food intake and where your food's coming from, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. It could potentially reduce your risk of diabetes, obesity, certain cancers. I think it's worth it. So I wouldn't just assume everything that's sold is safe because we really don't have the evidence to really prove that. And so why not avoid things that are easier to avoid?
All right. Well, this has been super fun, super informative, as usual. Dr. Emily Cooper, Andrea Taylor, thank you so much for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.